The early 1960s were a transitional moment for the American auto industry. Post-war prosperity meant that more Americans had disposable income to spend, and cars were no longer just tools for transportation. They were reflections of personality, status, and lifestyle. Teenagers and young adults, a growing consumer group with money to burn, wanted vehicles that looked sporty, sounded aggressive, and felt thrilling behind the wheel. At the same time, Detroit's big three automakers, General Motors, Ford, and Chrysler, were locked in a fierce battle for dominance. It was during this cultural and economic backdrop that Pontiac, once seen as a conservative brand appealing mostly to older buyers, made a daring gamble that would not only redefine itself, but also set the stage for one of the most controversial vehicles in history, the Pontiac GTO. Pontiac's leadership team, led by visionary executives like John DeLorean, Jim Wongers, and Pete Estes, saw an opportunity where others saw a boundary. General Motors had imposed strict corporate guidelines at the time, including a rule that restricted mid-sized cars from having engines larger than 330 cubic inches. This policy was intended to maintain a clear distinction between GM's family-friendly offerings and its larger, performance-oriented full-size cars. DeLorean, however, believed the rule was outdated and stifled innovation. He and his team devised a clever workaround by offering the GTO not as a standalone model, but as an option package for the Pontiac Tempest and later the Lemons. By doing so, they could install a 389 cubic inch V8 into a mid-size frame without directly violating GM's ban. It was a bold move that skirted corporate restrictions, but also opened up a Pandora's box of controversy. When the GTO was introduced in 1964, the reaction was immediate and divided. For enthusiasts, it was a dream come true, a mid-sized, relatively affordable car that delivered the kind of power and performance usually reserved for big, expensive machines. Its name, borrowed from Ferrari's legendary 250 GTO, carried an air of exotic prestige, suggesting that this was not just another Detroit car, but something that aspired to global recognition. Car magazines raved about the GTO's acceleration, quarter-mile times, and street presence, cementing its reputation as the first true muscle car. But just as quickly, critics emerged to condemn it. Safety advocates argued that Pontiac was irresponsibly selling massive horsepower to young, inexperienced drivers. The car's marketing campaigns, which often emphasized speed, tire smoke, and street dominance, only fueled concerns that the GTO was promoting reckless driving. Even within General Motors, there was unease about how openly Pontiac had bent the rules. Some executives worried that if the GTO succeeded, it would encourage other divisions to push boundaries, escalating a horsepower race that might draw unwanted scrutiny from lawmakers and regulators. Their fears proved to be valid. Almost immediately, other automakers jumped on the trend. The GTO's success gave birth to a new generation of cars like the Chevrolet Chevelle, Oldsmobile 442, and Plymouth Roadrunner, all of which followed Pontiac's formula of stuffing big engines into mid-sized bodies. What began as a creative loophole soon became a movement, and the GTO stood at the center of the storm, celebrated as an icon by fans while simultaneously condemned by critics as the spark that lit a dangerous fire. The controversy surrounding the GTO's birth was not just about the car itself, but about what it represented. A rebellion against corporate rules, a challenge to safety norms, and a redefinition of what an American car could be. Its arrival forced the industry, regulators, and the public to confront uncomfortable questions. Should automakers be free to build whatever sold, regardless of potential societal consequences? Was raw horsepower a symbol of freedom and progress, or an irresponsible indulgence that put lives at risk? The Pontiac GTO, in its very first years, became more than just a car. It became a cultural lightning rod that embodied the tensions of its time. By the mid to late 1960s, the Pontiac GTO had moved far beyond its original role as a clever option package. It had become a cultural icon and the flagship of the muscle car movement. Young drivers idolized it, car magazines celebrated it, and dealers couldn't keep up with demand. Pontiac capitalized on this momentum with increasingly bold styling and performance options, culminating in models like the flamboyant 1969 GTO Judge. The Judge, marketed with the slogan, "Here comes the Judge," was brash, colorful, and unapologetically loud in both design and personality. By this point, the GTO was not just a car but a statement. one that symbolized youthful rebellion, freedom, and the thrill of American horsepower. It was everything its creators had hoped for, but its very success began attracting the wrong kind of attention. Insurance companies were among the first to react to the growing muscle car craze. As accident and fatality rates among young drivers increased, insurers identified powerful mid-size cars like the GTO as high-risk vehicles. Premiums skyrocketed for owners, sometimes costing nearly as much as monthly car payments. For many enthusiasts, the GTO was affordable to purchase, but cripplingly expensive to insure, creating an economic barrier that slowed sales growth. Meanwhile, consumer advocates, most notably Ralph Nader, intensified their criticism of muscle cars as inherently unsafe. Nader, who had already shaken the auto industry with his book Unsafe at Any Speed, argued that manufacturers were irresponsibly glorifying speed while neglecting basic safety features such as adequate brakes, crash protection, and handling stability. In his view, cars like the GTO weren't engineering marvels, but rolling hazards marketed to thrill seekers. The federal government soon followed with its own pushback. By the late 1960s and early 1970s, new safety regulations and emissions standards began tightening around Detroit. The GTO found itself caught in the crosshairs. On one side, it represented the best of what American automakers could achieve: big displacement, roaring exhaust notes, and aggressive styling that made a statement. On the other, it became a scapegoat for critics of the horsepower wars that manufacturers were waging. The Environmental Protection Agency, EPA, established in 1970, enforced stricter emissions controls that gradually strangled the GTO's performance. At the same time, the federal government's growing concern about rising highway deaths placed further political pressure on muscle cars. What had once been celebrated as symbols of innovation were now cast as reckless indulgences contributing to social problems. Despite these pressures, Pontiac continued to lean into the GTO's rebellious image. Advertisements highlighted its speed, its ability to dominate at traffic lights, and its larger-than-life persona. But while the marketing resonated with enthusiasts, it also provided fuel for critics who saw the car as irresponsible. The tension between cultural adoration and political backlash grew sharper each year. Enthusiasts argued that muscle cars like the GTO empowered ordinary Americans to experience the thrill of high performance without paying exotic sports car prices. Regulators and critics countered that this democratization of horsepower had led to more accidents, higher insurance rates, and greater environmental damage. The divide was not just about cars. It reflected broader social debates about personal freedom versus collective responsibility, individual thrill-seeking versus public safety. By the early 1970s, this clash of forces reached a breaking point. The GTO, once the golden child of Pontiac's lineup, became a lightning rod in the national debate over cars, culture, and safety. It was both admired and condemned, praised for pioneering a new automotive era, and blamed for fueling a dangerous arms race in performance. The controversy surrounding the GTO during this period cemented its place in history as not just a car, but as a cultural flashpoint in America's ongoing struggle between passion and regulation.